It was a regular Tuesday morning, the kind where the office still smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner, and nobody was talking above a polite murmur. I had my laptop open at my desk, one hand on the trackpad, the other around a paper cup that had already gone lukewarm. I was doing a final pass on the deck, spacing, numbers, the little details nobody notices until they're wrong. That's when my manager, Brent, walked up behind me. He didn't ask what I was working on. He didn't even lean in to look. He just reached out, closed my laptop halfway, and slid it a few inches away from me like he was moving something off a table. "We'll handle the client meeting," he said, like it was already decided. "You're not senior enough for this one." I didn't say anything right away. I kept my face neutral. I nodded once, like I'd heard him, like it didn't hit me in the stomach the way it did. Because the truth was, that meeting was my work. 5 months of analysis, weeks of late nights, a full rebuild of a plan nobody else wanted to touch until it started looking valuable. And now I was watching it get picked up and carried away. Brent smiled when he said it. Not a big smile, just that small, tight thing at the corner of his mouth that meant he expected me to accept it. I did what I'd trained myself to do in corporate settings. I swallowed whatever reaction wanted to rise up, and I said quietly, "Okay." A few minutes later, I watched him walk toward the conference wing with 2 other people, Evan and Claire, both holding printed copies of my deck. They didn't even bother changing the footer. My initials were still there on the last slide, like a mistake they hadn't noticed yet. I sat back in my chair and listened to the hum of the HVAC, the soft clack of keyboards, the distant sound of someone laughing near the break room. Then my phone buzzed once, face up on my desk. It was a calendar invite that hadn't been there a minute earlier. No message, no explanation, just a meeting title I didn't recognize and a time stamped for later that afternoon. I stared at it for a second, then set the phone face down, and I went back to my desk like nothing had happened. My name is Natalie Price. I was 35 at the time, and I worked in Dallas at a mid-size consulting firm called Hartwell Systems, in a glass building where every conference room had transparent walls, so everyone could see who mattered and who didn't. When I joined Hartwell, I wasn't entry-level. I wasn't new. I'd spent over a decade in data infrastructure and optimization work, the kind that's painfully unglamorous, but saves companies real money when you do it right. Most people don't understand it. They just like the results. The client we were chasing was Stonebridge Capital. Their account wasn't just nice to have. It was the one the executive team talked about in closed-door meetings. The one that came with promotion whispers, bonus rumors, and quiet anxiety. Hartwell had been pitching Stonebridge for years without landing anything significant. Then, a few months after I arrived, I noticed something in their operational data, an inefficiency that wasn't obvious unless you'd spent years learning what patterns shouldn't be there. It was subtle, buried, but it was expensive. I ran the numbers twice, then a third time, because I didn't want to be wrong. The estimate came out to about $3.1 million a year in preventable loss. When I showed my findings to my direct supervisor, Renee, she didn't get excited. She got quiet, leaned forward, reread the summary, and asked me to walk her through it again from the top. When I finished, she exhaled through her nose and said, "Okay, this is real." Renee was one of the only directors in our division who didn't talk over people. She listened, took notes, asked clean questions. I trusted her in the simple way you trust someone who acts like they're not trying to win the room. We spent weeks building the proposal the right way, not just a pitch, a solution. I built the analysis, the implementation plan, the cost model, and a phased transition strategy designed to keep Stonebridge's system stable while we migrated. I documented everything: version control, meeting notes, email threads, every assumption tied to a source, every number tied to a file. Then we got word that Stonebridge wanted an in-person presentation. Not a quick call, not a casual walkthrough. Their executive group was coming, including their CTO, someone with a reputation for being sharp and impatient with fluff. The office energy shifted immediately. People started walking faster, talking louder, dropping by my desk with questions they could have asked weeks ago. At the department meeting that afternoon, Brent stood at the front with his hands clasped like he was already celebrating. "Great work, team," he said. "Renee and I will finalize the presentation strategy. We need our absolute best." I waited for my name to come up. I didn't need applause, I just needed to be in the room. But the meeting ended without anyone assigning my role. And later, quietly, near my desk, Renee stopped by and told me what Brent had decided, that I'd be on standby, just in case. I listened. I nodded. I didn't raise my voice. And when she walked away, I opened my laptop again and stared at the slide that mattered most. Then I made one small change that I didn't explain to anyone. After that, I just sat there, hands resting on the keyboard, watching the conference room lights flick on down the hall. Then I waited. The morning of the presentation, I got in earlier than usual. The office was still half dark, overhead lights in that dim, saving energy mode, and the cleaning crew had just finished vacuuming. The carpet had those fresh lines in it. It smelled faintly like lemon polish near the reception desk. I hung my coat on the back of my chair, powered up my monitors, and opened the folder where I kept everything related to Stonebridge. Renee had told me the night before, quietly, "Just stay close. If they ask something specific, I'll bring you in." We both knew what it was. A polite way of saying, "You're not invited, but don't leave the building." I didn't argue with her, not because I agreed, but because arguing in that moment wouldn't change Brent's decision. It would only give him a reason to label me difficult. So I kept my tone even and said, "Okay, I'll be here." At 9:30, the Stonebridge team arrived. I could see them through the glass at the front, people moving with the calm confidence of executives who were used to walking into other companies' spaces and being treated like gravity had shifted for them. Men in tailored suits, 2 women in sharp, understated outfits, no wasted gestures, no chatter that looked like nerves. Brent stepped forward with his practiced smile, shaking hands like he'd known them for years. Renee stood slightly behind him, posture straight, face composed. Evan and Claire followed with leather portfolios. Ours had the Hartwell logo stamped in silver on the front. The kind of detail leadership liked because it looked premium. The conference room they used was the biggest one, centered in the office with glass walls. You could see straight in from the corridor, but you couldn't hear anything unless you were standing close and reading lips. They wanted the whole floor to watch. I stayed at my desk about 30 feet away and kept my screen open like I was working. Every few minutes, I'd glance up. 10 minutes in, Brent was already gesturing at my slide deck, moving his hands like he was explaining something that came naturally to him. 20 minutes in, Renee had a marker in her hand, pointing at a diagram I'd drawn late one night after the 3rd revision didn't feel clear enough. Half an hour in, I saw the Stonebridge CTO lean forward in her chair. She had short salt and pepper hair and a posture that didn't soften for anyone. Even from across the room, I could tell she was listening hard. Not politely, seriously. That was the moment I felt something shift in me. Not anger, not panic. More like a quiet clarity. They were presenting my work, taking credit for it with their bodies and their voices and their little confident pauses. But the deck they were holding wasn't complete. 3 days earlier, right after Brent told me I wasn't senior enough, I went back through the implementation section and removed one critical technical specification. Not the overall concept, not the pitch, just the mechanism that made the transition safe. It was a verification and encryption process that prevented data corruption during the migration. Without it, the solution still looked impressive on paper, but it couldn't be executed reliably. It would be risky, and Stonebridge's CTO would see that within minutes. I told myself it was for security, that it was proprietary, that I didn't want something that sensitive sitting in a deck that got emailed around. Some of that was true. But sitting there watching Brent speak over my slides, I admitted the other truth to myself. It was leverage. If they were going to erase me, then sooner or later, they were going to run into something they couldn't fake their way through. And when they did, they'd have to acknowledge the person who actually built it. 40 minutes into the meeting, I saw it happen. The CTO asked something. Her head tilted slightly, and her expression tightened in that focused way technical people get when a detail doesn't line up. Brent's smile paused. Renee flipped through her printed pages, faster than she should have needed to. Evan leaned in and whispered something, but I could tell he wasn't helping. He didn't have it. Then, almost all at once, everyone in the room turned their heads toward the glass wall. Toward me. Like I'd been sitting there the whole time as a last resort, and now they'd reached it. My phone buzzed. A text from Renee. Conference room. Now. I didn't move immediately. Not out of hesitation, out of control. I took one slow breath, set my pen down, and stood up. Around me, a few coworkers lifted their eyes, pretending not to stare. You could feel curiosity moving through the air like a draft. I adjusted my blazer at the shoulders, not rushing, and walked the corridor toward that glass room. 30 feet felt like a long distance when you could see everyone watching you cross it. When I opened the door, the room went quiet in a way that felt physical. Brent turned toward me with a smile that was supposed to look welcoming, but didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, there she is," he said. Natalie helped compile some of the supporting data. Some of the supporting data? The Stonebridge CTO looked directly at me. There was no smile on her face, just attention. "Ms. Price," she said, glancing down at the slide in front of her, "your colleagues can't explain the specific process you're referencing here, what prevents data corruption during the transition phase. The concept is mentioned, but the mechanism isn't." She tapped the page lightly with one finger. "Without that, this proposal is interesting in theory, but it's not workable for us." Nobody spoke. Brent's face had gone slightly red along the edges. Renee looked tense, like she was hoping I'd save them without saying anything that would expose what they'd done. I took a seat at the table, not by the door, not off to the side. I sat across from the CTO, like I belonged there. Then I looked down at the printed slide, and I said calmly, "It isn't in the deck." I didn't rush to fill the silence after that. I let the words sit there. "It isn't in the deck," I repeated evenly, my hands resting flat on the table. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it's too complex to communicate accurately in slides. Brent shifted in his chair. I felt it more than I saw it. Renee kept her eyes on me, but I couldn't read what she was thinking yet. The CTO, Karen Mitchell, according to the placard in front of her, didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked relieved. "So, it does exist," she said. "Yes," I replied. "It's a 9-step process that combines staged verification with a layered encryption check. I designed it specifically around Stonebridge's infrastructure constraints." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Not skepticism, interest. "You designed it?" she repeated, careful with the words. "Yes." Brent cleared his throat, a sharp, uncomfortable sound. "Natalie's been part of the broader analysis," he started, leaning forward. "We worked very collaboratively." Karen raised her hand without looking at him. "Let her finish," she said. That was the first real shift. Not dramatic, not loud. Just authority being applied in a direction Brent wasn't used to. I stood up and walked to the whiteboard. Someone slid a marker toward me without asking. I uncapped it and began to draw, slowly, deliberately. I explained the process step by step, not like a pitch, like an engineer talking to another engineer, where the risk lived, how it was isolated, why the transition didn't corrupt live data, what failed first if something went wrong, and how we caught it before it mattered. Karen asked questions, precise ones. So did her technical director, seated to her left. I answered without reaching for notes, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I knew the system the way you know something you've built with your own hands. Behind me, I could feel the room changing. Brent stopped moving altogether. Renee stayed quiet, listening, but I could tell she was no longer trying to intervene. They couldn't follow all of it, not because they weren't smart, but because they hadn't done the work, and that difference was now visible. When I finished, I set the marker down and took my seat again. Karen leaned back, arms crossed loosely. "Well," she said after a moment, "that clarifies things." Then she turned to Brent for the first time since I'd started speaking. "I'm curious why Ms. Price wasn't part of this presentation from the beginning, given that she appears to be the architect of the solution." Brent smiled again, but this one was strained. "We generally reserve client-facing opportunities of this scale for senior leadership," he said. "Experience has shown—" "In my experience," Karen cut in calmly, "the people who do the work give the most useful explanations." She turned back to me. "If we move forward with Hartwell, would you be leading the implementation?" Brent inhaled, clearly preparing to answer. "I would," I said before he could. "That would be my expectation." There it was, not defiant, not emotional, just clear. Karen nodded once. "Good, because I'm not interested in working through layers of people who can't answer technical questions." The meeting wrapped up shortly after that. Handshakes, polite closing remarks, a promise to follow up. As the Stonebridge team gathered their things, Karen paused next to me and handed me her card. "Email me directly," she said. "I'll have more questions once I review this in detail." Not to Brent, not to Renee, to me. When the door closed behind them, the room felt smaller. Brent turned toward me, his jaw tight. Renee stared at the table. "What was that?" Brent said, keeping his voice low. "I answered the client's question," I replied. "You deliberately left that out of the materials," he said. "You made us look unprepared." "I focused the slides on what made sense in that format," I said. "The rest required direct explanation." Renee finally looked up. "You should have told us." I met her eyes. Would it have changed anything? Neither of them answered. Brent stepped closer, blocking the path to the door. "This isn't over," he said quietly. I nodded once. I didn't think it was. When I walked back to my desk, people looked up and then looked away. Nobody asked anything. I sat down, opened my email, and saw a new calendar invite waiting for me. This one was from HR. And the CEO was on it. The meeting was scheduled for 4:30. That gave me just under 3 hours. I didn't panic. I didn't send texts. I didn't ask anyone what it was about, even though a few people glanced at my screen and clearly noticed the subject line. I closed my inbox, opened a fresh folder, and started working through things in order. Step 1. Documentation. Every version of the Stonebridge files I'd touched was already saved with timestamps. I pulled the originals, the edits, the comments, and the approval notes. I exported email threads where I'd flagged risks, proposed solutions, and summarized decisions. Nothing dramatic, just facts, arranged cleanly. Step 2. Attribution. I listed who contributed to what. Not opinions, just lines of responsibility. Who authored the models, who built the transition logic, who reviewed versus who created. I included meeting invites, follow-up notes, and the moments where my role had quietly shifted from lead to support without explanation. Step 3. Backup. I printed everything. 2 copies. One went into a slim folder. The other I scanned and sent to my personal email, then archived. When I finished, I stacked the papers neatly, shut my laptop, and waited. At 4:28, I stood up. The walk to the executive floor was quiet. Most people had already packed up for the day, but the lights were still on in the corner offices. I could hear muffled voices through one closed door, someone laughing too loudly somewhere down the hall. Richard Hale's office was at the end. When I stepped inside, he was already seated behind his desk. Brent was there, Renee was there, and so was Michelle from HR, sitting slightly apart with a legal pad on her knee. Richard didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. "Natalie, take a seat," he said. "We need to discuss what happened today." I sat down and placed my folder on the table in front of me. Flat. Centered. Brent spoke first. "She deliberately sabotaged the presentation," he said. "She withheld critical information to make leadership look incompetent." Richard turned to me. "Is that true?" I took a breath. Not because I needed to steady myself, but because I wanted to answer precisely. "What's true," I said, "is that I developed the Stonebridge proposal over 5 months. What's true is that 3 days ago, I was told I wasn't senior enough to present my own work. And what's true is that the missing component couldn't be meaningfully explained without direct technical discussion." Brent leaned forward. "You're dodging the point." Richard raised his hand. "Let her finish." I opened the folder. "Here is a timeline of the project," I said, sliding the first page forward. "These are the emails where I identified the inefficiency. These are the drafts showing authorship. These are meeting notes documenting design decisions." Michelle shifted slightly in her chair. "I'm not accusing anyone," I continued. "I'm establishing facts. The people presenting today couldn't answer the CTO's questions because they didn't design the system. I did." Renee stared at the table. Brent's face had gone rigid. "You manipulated the situation," Brent said. "You admit that." "Yes," I replied calmly. "I made a calculated decision to protect my work. No data was falsified, no client was misled, and the outcome preserved the account." Richard leaned back, studying me. "Why take that risk?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately, because this was the part that mattered. "Because if I hadn't," I said quietly, "you would never have known what actually happened in that room, and neither would the client." Brent opened his mouth. Richard didn't let him speak. "Michelle," Richard said, turning slightly, "have we heard from Stonebridge since the meeting?" She nodded. "Yes. Karen Mitchell emailed an hour ago. She was very clear." Brent stiffened. "She specifically praised Natalie's technical explanation," Michelle continued, "and she requested that Natalie be the primary point of contact going forward." The room went still. Richard turned back to me. "Can you deliver what you promised them?" "Yes," I said, "and I will." He nodded once. Then he looked at Brent and Renee. "Leave us," he said. They hesitated, then stood. Brent straightened his jacket like he was regaining control of something. Renee didn't look at me as she passed. When the door closed, Richard folded his hands on the desk. "That was a dangerous move," he said. "It wasn't a move," I replied. "It was a boundary." He considered that. "You understand," he said, "that withholding information, even strategically, creates risk for the company." "I do," I said, "and I understand that erasing the people who build value creates a bigger one." For the first time, a hint of a smile crossed his face. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You'll lead the Stonebridge implementation. You'll report directly to me on that project." I nodded. "If you deliver," he continued, "we'll revisit your role here. If you don't, this conversation changes." "Understood." As I stood to leave, he added one last thing. "The algorithm," he said. "Is it documented now?" "It will be by morning," I replied. "Good," he said. "Don't make that kind of leverage play again." I paused at the door. "I won't need to," I said. "Once is enough." Then I stepped into the hallway and let the door close behind me. The next 2 weeks passed quietly on the surface, too quietly. People in the office smiled more carefully around me. Conversations lowered when I walked by. Brent avoided my side of the floor entirely. Renee stopped by once, stood near my desk without sitting, and said, "I hope you understand how complicated this all is." I nodded, because I did understand. That was the problem. I focused on the work. Stonebridge wanted everything documented, reviewed, and structured in a way that made implementation predictable. That suited me. I rebuilt the technical specs from the ground up, formalized the algorithm, and logged every assumption. I pulled Raj from development into the process, someone who'd always done solid work without needing attention. He looked over one of the diagrams and said quietly, "About time they let you run this." We worked late a few nights, not rushing, just doing things cleanly. A week after the presentation, Karen Mitchell requested a video call. Not a group call, not a check-in with leadership, just me. When her face appeared on the screen, she didn't waste time. "I've reviewed the documentation," she said. "It's thorough, and it confirms what I suspected in the meeting." I waited. "Stonebridge is prepared to move forward," she continued. "But we have conditions." I took notes as she spoke. First, I would be designated as project lead in the contract itself, not just internally. Second, quarterly technical reviews would be conducted directly with me. Third, and this was the one that changed the air, Stonebridge wanted the option to engage me directly as a consultant if Hartwell couldn't support the implementation appropriately. "I want continuity," Karen said, "and accountability." After the call ended, I sat still for a moment, then drafted an email to Richard outlining the conditions exactly as stated. No commentary, no framing. His reply came 30 minutes later. My office. 3 o'clock. This time, legal was there. The discussion was controlled, precise. No raised voices. Legal flagged risk. Richard listened. I responded with facts. "This isn't about me leaving," I said. "It's about recognizing where the value comes from and protecting the client relationship." Richard studied me for a long moment. "Do you believe the company has done that so far?" he asked. "No," I replied. "But it can." The negotiation lasted 2 hours. When it ended, the terms were clear. I would remain project lead. I would be promoted to technical director. I would report directly to Richard, and a performance-based bonus would be tied to the Stonebridge contract. Legal didn't like it. Richard approved it anyway. "This sets a precedent," Legal warned. "Yes," Richard said. "The right one." When the contract was signed the following Monday, Richard called an all-hands meeting. He announced the Stonebridge deal. He announced the numbers. And then he announced my promotion. I stood near the back, hands folded, listening as the room absorbed it. I didn't look at Brent. I didn't need to. After the meeting, he approached me anyway. "Enjoy it while it lasts," he said quietly. "I am," I replied, professionally. He watched me for a second longer, then walked away. That afternoon, I sent one email. It was a request to audit ongoing projects for attribution and documentation standards. Richard approved it within minutes. Then I closed my laptop. And for the first time in a long while, I left the office before sunset. 6 months later, I was sitting in a quiet conference room on the 22nd floor of Stonebridge's headquarters. The windows faced east. Morning light came in clean and pale, reflecting off the table's polished surface. A car horn sounded faintly somewhere below, then disappeared. Karen Mitchell sat across from me, flipping through a printed report. The rest of her team listened without interrupting. "The first phase exceeded projections," she said, finally looking up. "By 7%. I nodded. The verification layer stabilized faster than expected. She smiled slightly. Not approval, recognition. "You delivered exactly what you said you would." When the meeting ended, there were no speeches, just handshakes, a few quiet side conversations, and a shared understanding that the work spoke for itself. Back at Hartwell, things had settled into a new shape. I'd built a small technical group from the ground up. Raj was there, along with 3 analysts who'd been quietly doing real work for years without much visibility. We met weekly, documented everything, and spoke directly with clients. No filters, no figureheads. Brent had been reassigned to a special initiatives role that came with a smaller team and fewer meetings that mattered. He stopped coming to my floor entirely. Renee tried, once, to reset our relationship. Over coffee, she said, I should have pushed harder. I believed she meant it, but I also knew some things don't undo themselves. I know, I said. That's why things are different now. She nodded. We kept it professional after that. One afternoon, Richard called me into his office again. This time, there was no tension in the room. 2 companies have reached out, he said, sliding contracts across his desk. Both requested you and your team specifically. Combined value is around $12 million. I reviewed the summaries carefully. No rush. We can take them, I said, if we structure it right. Richard leaned back. You know, when you withheld that algorithm, I almost terminated you. I know, I said. But, he continued, it forced something into the open that needed to be addressed. This company relied too heavily on presentation and not enough on substance. He paused. Just keep doing it the right way. I left his office and returned to my desk, where my team was waiting for a decision on resource allocation. I answered their questions. We adjusted timelines. We moved on. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I stayed a few minutes longer. I reviewed the project logs one last time, backed them up, then shut my computer down. Everything was documented now. Nothing hidden, nothing waiting to be discovered. That night, I didn't celebrate. I went home, set my keys in the same bowl by the door, and made a simple dinner. Pasta, olive oil, nothing complicated. I ate at the counter with the window cracked open, listening to the city settle into itself. Afterward, I washed the dishes slowly, dried them, and put them away. The routine mattered. It reminded me that my life wasn't the office, even when the office finally learned how to treat me. Later, I stepped out onto my balcony with a mug of tea. The lights downtown were steady, not impressive, just there. I thought about how close I'd come to staying quiet, how easily I could have convinced myself that patience meant acceptance. One small decision, removing a single technical detail from a slide deck, had changed the direction of everything. Not because it was clever, not because it was bold, but because it forced the truth into the open. I still keep Karen Mitchell's card in my wallet. I never had to use the option she offered. I didn't need an escape. But knowing it existed gave me the calm to stand my ground instead of shrinking back into the role I'd been assigned. Since then, I've watched other people go through similar moments. A junior engineer whose ideas keep getting filtered. A project manager whose name never makes it onto the final document. A woman who's told to wait her turn while someone else speaks for her. Sometimes they ask for advice. Sometimes they don't. When they do, I don't tell them to fight. I don't tell them to quit. I don't tell them to make noise. I tell them to document their work, to understand the system they're in, and to decide quietly where their line is. Silence can be a strategy, but only when it's chosen. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, you're not imagining it, and you're not alone. I'm careful now about where I spend my energy. I protect my team. I insist on credit being clear. I don't raise my voice, and I don't rush decisions. Order has a way of changing things, and sometimes the most effective moment isn't loud at all. It's the moment you refuse to be invisible. If this story resonated with you, I'd love for you to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel reach people who might need to hear these stories quietly, the way they're meant to be told. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from, and what time it is there right now. I read more of those than you might think. 2 more stories will be coming up next, both shared by people who found themselves underestimated in ways that changed everything. Thank you for listening.